Welcome back, everybody. This is our penultimate plenary session on freedom, progress, and the public. And the reason all of you are sitting up here is because we all, obviously, in this room share this view, this passion for how economic and individual freedom can make everyone's lives better. But the thing that all three of you bring to the table in different ways is that you've been either students or practitioners of how actually to do that, how to persuade the public that this matters at a time when not everyone shares this view, right? This may have been a universal American principle 50, 70 years ago, but it's not right now. And so, Kristen, you're obviously an accomplished pollster. You're in the media all the time. You're talking to people. Lanhi, along with all of the things that everyone knows about Lanhi, ran for a comptroller in California. So trying to send this message to the blue staters and making a lot of headway, I would say. So I'm going to be interested to learn from you on that. And then Joe, as somebody who is also interacting with people every day out there, ordinary people who are thinking through these issues with you. I think we're going to have an interesting conversation here. So I'm just going to throw a jump ball. Who wants to start? Like, who's really just got, who's thinking, we have this 24 race. We have other things going on. One of the arguments I hear when I do interviews about, freedom and conservatism in particular is, well, you guys are all in retreat. I mean, it's the nationalists who are running the show. People aren't really interested in freedom right now. There's populism on the left and the right. People aren't really satisfied with what's going on in the world. Maybe let's start with you, Kristen. Put some data behind these narratives.
Well, thank you so much for having me here, Vivek, and thank you all for participating in this. I have been so excited about the existence of FREOPP and to have an organization that is driving this really important message that there does not need to be a contradiction between supporting limited government and liberty and also believing that Americans up and down the income spectrum and of all walks of life deserve dignity, the ability to work, contribute, and experience prosperity and opportunity. And so I'm so glad that that this group is just going strong and that you all are assembled today. We are in some really interesting times in terms of the gap between what I see in polls in terms of politics and policy. In terms of politics, depends on which poll you look at. It will tell you whether Republicans or Democrats are ascendant. There was a lot of polling that came out over the last weekend showing that if the election were held today, Joe Biden and Donald Trump would be very closely matched, relatively closely matched, depending on how much you can consider polls a year out to be predictive of much of anything. But that really there's a big wake-up call on the left that, kind of older models of, well, sure, big government can just come in and fix everything is not trusted by very many voters. This is why, frankly, you see in polls somebody like an RFK Jr., or really just any third-party candidate with even minimal name ID, suddenly getting 20+%. That's very, very unusual. And it speaks to the level of dissatisfaction that's out there. At the same time, it doesn't mean that voters necessarily think, conservatives have all the answers. For better or worse, for the last, I would say, decade and a half, the right has really set itself up as successful as opposition, but has struggled when it comes to the task of governing. So when Republicans are not in power, suddenly the pendulum swings and voters suddenly start caring a little bit more about the national debt and those sorts of things. But when the right is in power, that stuff kind of winds up getting pushed to the background. And so something that I think is frustrating to me and that I'd be excited to hear what the other panelists have to say is that it seems to me that nowadays the center-right and really the right have become very focused on what shouldn't be done or what is bad policy or what we oppose, and that there's still a real struggle to articulate, okay, what is the right-of-center policy that is going to bring down food prices? We know that inflation is a top issue for many voters, and we know that they believe that big government spending and the policies of Joe Biden have been a big driver of things like inflation, the fact that you go to the grocery store and everything costs so much. But at the same time, there's not a clear sense of what would folks on the right of center do to make it so that somebody who's living paycheck to paycheck doesn't have to stress out over buying eggs next week. And that's something where I really think it's important for the right to be prepared, that we may have an election in 2024 that does hand power back to those on the right in a bigger way than they have now. But at that point, you will be tasked with governing. And what do you intend to do at that point? And I think that is still a far too big a question mark. It means that it is leaving sort of popular support on the table.
Great. Anyone else? Joe, why don't we go to your end? You want to go to Lonnie first? Okay.
I'll go, and then
Yeah.
Lonnie can bring I agree with so much of what Kirsten just said. I think, like we're living in a populist moment, and I think a lot of people haven't gotten that. A lot of right-wing thinkers haven't gotten that. A lot of people in the freedom space haven't gotten that. I come from kind of the MAGA populist base. I was elected to Congress back in 2010. I was part of the Tea Party wave. That was a very populist movement. I think this freedom movement that we all believe in and want to spread and make relevant politically today somehow has to reconcile with the fact that we are in a populist movement. You got to connect it to regular people. Regular people are pissed off at everybody. This is going to continue for a while. And how do you take these ideas of freedom and limited government and relate them to everyday people? I just think we get stuck in we're an intellectual movement, and we're missing the fight that's out there right now. The right, the other right, the right that I left, the nationalistic right, the right that wants to use government to advance shit, to their credit, they've connected their ideology with regular people. Those of us who believe in freedom, limited government, we got to somehow do that and get out of our think tank world.
Hey.
I love think tanks. I come from think tanks.
Yeah. So I think that there's this interesting dynamic going on, and we've seen it, I think, for many years, where people will say that I really care about policy, right? Not me personally, but like they'll say, oh, voters care about policy and they care about people advancing solutions. And then when you actually give them solutions, they're really not that interested in hearing about them. They really would much rather talk about many other things. And so I think Joe's key insight, which I really subscribe to, is how do you make policy relatable for people? How do you create an agenda that's attractive not only in tone and in how it comes off, but also in substance? And I think that is one thing that people who sort of subscribe to the more populist notions of where the country ought to be going, I think they've managed to create an agenda that sounds very good to a lot of people, and I think people tend to say, well, yeah, I could be for that. But then there's a disconnect between that and the reality of what it would mean, and what it would mean for the American people, and what it would mean for the role and nature of the federal government. And so I think that the key tie-in has to be, how do you have an agenda that not only will do and accomplish the things that I think we want, which is, advancing freedom and opportunity, for example, and how do you square that with the reality of what people want to hear and what resonates with people, what resonates with voters? I mean, I spent a year and a half talking about fiscal responsibility in a state where there really is none, right? I mean, they blew $25-30 billion on unemployment insurance benefits that went to people in Russia, China, and South America, and trying to convince people that this is a problem and here's what you got to do to address it. It's actually quite challenging because people are outraged that the money's been taken, but when you tell them, well, here are the solutions, then their eyes kind of glaze over and they don't want to talk about that. So there is this bridge we have to cross, I think, between ideas and action, and how you actually convey ideas in a way that people will say, oh yeah, I'm for that, and I believe in a movement that stands for something, not just against a bunch of stuff, as you noted.
Well, and a big piece of that is, not to be all, you've just got to find the right words and phrases, because I think that's sometimes a very intellectually lazy approach. Oh gosh, I have this policy and people would love it if only I changed the name from word A to word B. Like, it doesn't really work like that. But we can avoid causing ourselves harm by using language that really doesn't work, right? So for instance, I work for a lot of clients in, say, the healthcare and the education space. And I will encounter language that they'll want me to test around policies that are good policies. And it'll involve phrases like, this will help maximize value for students and families. I'm like, maximize value for students and families? Like, okay, I get kind of what you mean by that, and that's a good thing, right? We know that lots of public dollars get poured into public schools and they wind up getting wasted, and we're not actually seeing outcomes that are really helping kids to be on a path to success. But a phrase like, we need to ensure that we're maximizing value for students, like, sounds like we've come in as McKinsey consultants trying to tinker with widgets instead of kids that we're hoping will graduate and succeed one day. Or in the healthcare space, even things that seem, relatively simple and benign, like I've heard phrases like, we need to modernize our healthcare system. And a lot of people will go like, well, I don't know that not being modern is the problem. I think the problem is I just can't get in to see my doctor ever, or the bills are really high, and modernize sounds futuristic and expensive, and so that would be nice, but what's the trade-off? And so I think too often in kind of think tank policy world, we have words and phrases that we think, this is unassailable. Of course people want to maximize value for students. Of course people want to modernize the healthcare system. And then someone like me goes and actually takes that to real voters, and they come back with very legitimate questions, concerns, confusion about, what are you actually trying to tell me here? And so I think being very focused on not dumbing things down, but using plain and clear language that connects to how is this going to affect a student or a patient? What's it mean for their actual lives? Not kind of 35,000-foot conceptual language, I think is really, really important.
You guys are all reminding me of Bill Clinton in various ways. First he talked about putting people first. He was very much a guy who thought about policy in that outcomes-based way. But the other side of it is, the famous catchphrase of his campaign was, it's the economy, stupid. And it seems from polls that it still is the economy, stupid, right? So if that's true, but what I heard Lanhee and Joe, both of you saying, is that when you walk people through economic issues, they don't actually want to engage in them, even though polls all say the inflation, economy, high cost of healthcare, these are the things that people care about.
Yeah, I mean, there's an interesting reflection we have right now, which is that if you were to look at a variety of economic indicators, you might actually think, well, things are going okay. They're not going great, but they're not going horribly. And then when you ask people about how they feel, they don't feel good. They don't feel great. In fact, I think they feel that the economy really is leaving them behind. And so we have this sort of unprecedented amount, and Kristen will know the numbers better, but my sense is that there's an unprecedented amount of disaffection with what economic policy is or is not doing for people right now. And so I think, Avik, you're right. There's a tremendous amount of interest and concern in what are the solutions that are going to make my life better? But it's hard. Again, it's hard to translate that, right? Because really, what they want is they want their eggs to cost less, and they certainly want gas to cost less, and they want housing to cost less, and they don't want to be harassed by homeless people everywhere they go. I mean, these are the things that people really care about, and then articulating the solutions almost becomes secondary to demonstrating an understanding of those problems that people face on a day-to-day basis.
And part of this as well is the phrasing is so important, connecting is so important, but tone. I go on TV a lot. All three of us are on TV a lot, and I'm pushing and advocating the things I believe in: freedom, limited government, and all the rest. But because I come from a populist background, I'm kind of, I don't come across as a very smart guy. I don't, there's not that air. So many people that was a terrible thing to say about myself. There's an air about a lot of us in this movement that we're separate from the folks that we need to reach, and we're not connecting with them. A lot of it is just tone, like we're we're willing to fight, and we're willing to roll our sleeves up and fight for the things we believe in. A lot of us don't do enough of that, I think.
I don't watch cable news that much anymore. Forgive me to all
No.
of you.
A lot of people
As a
don't.
cable news
Except when
contributor, you've made
I'll
a
watch your
smart
clips on
choice.
Twitter. But if it is true that Americans care about the economy and they care about the price of eggs, when I turn on MSNBC or Fox or CNN or ABC, that's not what I'm seeing covered, particularly on the political shows. It's all Trump did this or, the border that. I mean, and the border is an important issue. I'm not saying it's not, but it's like I don't see the economic coverage. The coverage in these news channels doesn't seem to correlate to what voters say
No, and
they're concerned about.
that's a great point. And full disclosure, I mean, 86.4% of the time I'm on TV, I'm yelling about Trump. And this is the world we live in, and it's hard, as you all know, to get your message through, and it's going to be worse for this next year.
So then, how do you break through that? How do you if the producer or the anchor is telling you that the segment is about Trump said this outrageous thing or whatever it is that's not maybe what you think voters should care about? How do you try to get your message in there and despite what the segment is about, or do you just try to be a good panelist and just kind of follow instructions?
I mean, I, unlike most people in political media, I like to answer the question that I was asked generally, but I do think that it's valuable to come ready to, especially being in my line of work, being the person who oftentimes on these panels, my job is not to argue the policy case, my job is to argue the politics and to be the voice of the average voter in that conversation, to say, hey, I am a pollster, and I know people have tons of problems with polls, and we can get into that if you want separately, but that my job is to say, hey, people who live within a 2-mile radius of this studio all may think one thing, but I've spent a lot of time talking to people who live 2,000 miles from this studio, and here's what they have to say. And so I don't find it terribly challenging to engage with whatever the question is they've asked me about. Somebody said something crazy today. What do you think about this? Will this affect the election? No, it probably won't. You know what will affect the election? The fact that gas prices are still very high, the fact that food prices are still very high, the fact that we don't have any answer to how we're going to provide affordable housing, and if you're starting off, you're looking at a mortgage, it's going to have a 7 or 8% interest rate, and these are the things that are much more important than whatever some crazy person tweeted.
But it's not just economic, it's the whole issue, broad spectrum of freedom. I was on a couple days ago, a day or two after the report, that if Trump wins, he and his team are already plotting, right? They're already in talks to plot to use the power of government to go after their political enemies. And so that was the topic of it. And right away, I tried to contrast that as the antithesis of freedom, the very antithesis of freedom. I find myself often throwing the words fascism out there, having to explain what it means, but you take a little kernel like that and you show how against freedom that whole concept is.
Go ahead, Lonnie. Go ahead and comment, and then I'm just going to say, if anyone wants questions, raise your hand. We'll get the mics out to the audience.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's hard because the overwhelming narrative is usually, let's talk about Trump or let's talk about abortion. Those are the two most common things that, I mean, if you were to turn on any news program, probably those would be the two. You would not be able to escape a segment where those two issues did not come up in some way or another. And in reality, I think most people out there, maybe not the ones who are consuming the cable news, but most normal people out there, those are two of the issues that really aren't on their minds, right? And so I think, I mean, I always try to bring it back to some conversation about what I think is actually going on in the real world. And I do think that these economic concerns are very, very real for most Americans. And when you see and hear people talk about it, it's very easy to intellectualize the conversation about the economy and talk about, well, this data tells us that. And I mean, the reality is that people really, they feel the way they feel for a reason. There's not an irrationality to it. Someone the other day I was on with was saying, well, so irrational. People don't look at the numbers and realize how good the economy is. It's like, that's not really how it works, okay? Like, people
It's like
tell
inflation, right? People's,
Yeah.
oh, inflation is down, everything's fine.
Exactly.
It's
It's
like prices
like,
have
oh,
gone
it's
up by
great.
25% over the last 3
Right,
years.
it's like it's great. We're at 3.5, and we were at 7 a year ago. So aren't things great? And it's like I don't think most people feel like it's great, right? And so you can go through these really difficult cycles of trying to justify or trying to think about, well, what is it that I can say that's going to make the numbers seem right to people? And it's like, no, people just feel the way they feel. You have to, there's a certain amount that you have to accept. And you just have to recognize that the solutions should feed from how people actually feel in some ways.
How much do you find, Lonnie, I'll ask one more question. How much do you find that campaigning in California changed your views or your perspective, just having that greater exposure to ordinary people and how they perceive these things?
Don't hang out with a lot of ordinary people in my real life. It is truly, and Joe can talk about this. It is truly a humbling experience to confront. Not confront. That's the wrong word. It is a humbling experience to sit there and sort of realize that your fate is in the hands of other people politically, and that is one of the great things about our democracy is that you are there in an ideal world to serve those who send you to do a job. And the thing that I was struck by is there is a relationship that develops between the voters and the people who are seeking office in a pretty pure way. I had a number of people who would come up to me during the campaign and would just sort of start telling me their life story and start telling me about the challenges they're having with this issue or that issue. And they would sort of get 75% of the way through it, and I felt like obligated to be like, as controller, there's not much I can do about your kids' schools, but I really appreciate that you're telling me this, and I wish there was something more I could do, but I'm here to listen. And that bond that develops, the greatest people I met during my 1.5 or 2 years campaigning were not all wasn't the Arnold Schwarzeneggers of the world. It was really just the ordinary people who you do develop a relationship with, because there is a measure of trust and confidence that they put in you. And so that was, for me, the greatest part of the experience.
Yeah, that was a great theme of our conversations last night at dinner, was the value of listening to ordinary people, just listening, not just talking to them, but listening. And Bill Clinton was very good at that too, and Reagan too. It's like you listen to people and then apply your values to the challenges they have. And that's one of the reasons we've been so grateful to have Kristen and others involved in FREOPP from the very beginning, giving us that pipeline into what people actually think. Okay, let's take some questions. It's hard to see, but I'm sure there are hands. Okay, go ahead, Rebecca. Just tell me where to point.
Yes, John Burlock, Competitive Enterprise Institute. Great panel. Have a question specifically for Kristen, and but others are free to weigh in. You had written some years back, I think, in the Selfie Voter, about how the specific policy of equity crowdfunding and the Jumpstart Our Business Startups Act, which Republican House passed and then Obama signed in 2012, really resonated with younger voters. The idea that you didn't have to be, if you wanted to raise money among family and friends community, you didn't have to go through the SEC red tape of being a Fortune 500 company, and the person raising the money could give away actually shares in the company, investment return, rather than just T-shirts. Do you think that policy would still, which has been expanded somewhat by the Trump SEC, the amounts you can invest, would still resonate? And any other thoughts on ways of selling that and different policies like that, sort of democratizing markets like that?
Sure. So to give everybody background, and by the way, that's like a really deep cut from my book that came out 9 years ago. So thank you. I'm like, oh my goodness, I'm gonna cry. Somebody read my book. So I'll give you a brief background on basically I was going through and writing about how I wish that folks on the center right and right would be more comfortable talking about how getting rid of regulations isn't just nice at this 35,000 foot level, but here's actually how it can help your life. And the example I gave was that I believe the Jobs Act, it repealed the regulations that said you had to be an accredited SEC investor. It basically made it so that average people were able to crowdfund, kick some money in, and potentially see some real upside. And so this was getting rid of a financial regulation, which at the time was like, oh, we need more financial regulation. We've just come out of the crash. More regulation, more regulation, more regulation. And this was showing how actually it was regulation that was keeping average people from being able to experience prosperity. And so I wrote in the book that I lamented that this was like a perfect example where if you love liberty and you want to say liberty equals prosperity for average people, you should be trumpeting this from the rooftops. And yet it was the sort of thing that instead Obama was out doing interviews on MTV talking about it, and like he signed the bill, he's allowed to take credit for it too, but it was House Republicans that had first kind of pushed this through. Why would you not take advantage of it? The one thing that I do look back on and cringe a little bit about is, for instance, I think I wrote a lot in that chapter about things like Uber and how I was like, oh, you've got the cartel of the cab drivers, here's market competition that wants to provide a better service at less expense to average people, and we need to get regulation out of the way to allow more competition to flourish. Except in practice, that's not necessarily how it all went, that instead you wound up getting just a different cartel. And then once it kind of stopped being subsidized by Silicon Valley money, now if you try to get an Uber out here at the hotel, it might take you a little bit longer than even it would have taken you to get a cab before. And so there are certain things where I will even confess, I thought, oh, this is great. Here's a perfect example of like, get regulation out of the way and everything will be fine. And I frankly think the failure of some of that is why we now have this populist moment that for so long, I mean, myself included, we were trumpeting liberty will solve everything. And there are nuances there where if it actually doesn't lead to true competition, it just means hello to the old new boss, same as the old boss, that people go, you know, I don't like any of this. I don't trust any of you. I don't trust, you know, you told me free markets were going to fix this and now I can't get a ride. My eggs cost X amount of money, whatever. And I just think that it is important that one, we should tell the story of how liberty can create prosperity and tell it in these concrete ways where people go, gosh, I didn't know that government was preventing this really common sense thing from being possible. But at the same time being cognizant that there's a reason why this populist fervor has kicked up and that some of it was promises made by supporters of free markets that wound up not coming true because it wound up kind of converting into crony capitalism in the end.
Perfect.
Next question. All right, whoever's got the mic, I see a bunch of hands up. Your choice, Rebecca.
So earlier this morning, when you were interviewing the governor of New Hampshire, he talked about when it comes to some cultural and social issues, leaving those decisions to state and local governments or even like school districts. And I fully think that's a great idea. But at the same time, and maybe you were kind of going here, the right or conservatives over the past few decades have kind of ceded a lot of those culture conversations and focused on things like lower taxes and liberty. At the same time, like now, we do have some culture challenges. Like there are people at Harvard walking around with signs with a Star of David and it says, keep the world clean. So how can people who favor liberty, limited government, more kind of local control, have these culture conversations in a healthy way while also respecting the role of state and local governments?
Joe, why don't you take that?
I'll be brief, and I want to hear what Lonnie has to say. What's interesting is that the time we're living in now, it's pretty similar to see voices on the left want to shut down speech that makes them uncomfortable. We're seeing the same thing on the right, especially when it comes to a lot of these cultural issues. We're living through one of them right now with what happened on October 7th. I think, and I don't know how this, I don't know that there's polling been done on this yet, but the notion of not shutting down speech, but allowing speech and defeating that speech with other speech, different speech, better speech, I think that's a pretty nice plank to stand on. I would think that's something that young people would like, because I've just been blown away by the voices on the right the last 5 to 6 years wanting to shut down speech. I used to have a syndicated radio show, and every day I'd go on my show and I'd make fun of snowflakes on the left who can't handle speech they don't like. We're seeing the same thing on the right. So I think there's an opening there to say, you should be able to demonstrate for the Palestinian resistance in this country. You should have the freedom to be able to do that. But I should be able to demonstrate for Israel.
I think what we're struggling with is the breakdown in institutions. And we're really struggling with that because if you look at the institutions we would have trusted and we would have relied on to help arbitrate and moderate some of the cultural conversations we're having, which are inherently really difficult issues. None of those institutions are trusted to do that anymore, right? Whether it's the media, certainly not government. Educational institutions, I think, have really done themselves a massive disservice over the last several weeks in particular by not kind of modeling the ability to really call out quite forcefully hate when you see hate, right? For a variety of different reasons, their inability, and I'll show my bias here. I think the inability of many elite academic institutions in particular to be unable to identify a terrorist act as a hateful one that needed to be called out, while at the same time saying, look, there's a lot of people suffering, we understand that, but their inability to even do that speaks to the degree to which those institutions have been degraded.
And violence against women. A lot of it was sexual violence.
Well, right. I mean, and then you see these sort of ironic demonstrations of people calling for an expansion in women's rights in societies where that's a very foreign concept, right? So I trace it to the breakdown in institutions, and so I think we have to do a much better job of trying to rebuild some of those institutions that can cultivate trust. Because if you don't have those, what you end up with is this kind of word salad approach that people take, and it's decidedly. I mean, I do tend to agree that we need to promote the concept that people will say what they. I mean, it's America; they should be able to say what they want to say. But at the end of the day, if you don't have an institution that can come in and say, well, that's in bounds or that's out of bounds, or help people understand what's in and out of bounds, then everything very quickly becomes out of bounds or in bounds, right? And that's not what we want.
Mike, go ahead.
Yeah, today's election day, right? What can you offer to the audience about what to be looking for in the results, whether it's the governor's race, state Senate races in Virginia, or anything else that might be on the ballot?
The things that I am looking for are, one, are we seeing high or low turnout? This is just kind of both in the aggregate as well as, do you see particularly high turnout in college towns? Those sorts of things. Right now, a big question mark is, I see a lot of polling that indicates younger voters very disaffected, disillusioned, disappointed in everything. And normally that would be a recipe for them staying home. And nowadays, with the pretty left-leaning skew of most younger voters, that's bad news for Democrats, good news for Republicans. At the same time, throughout special election after special election after special election over the last year, since the overturning of Roe versus Wade, we have seen a really high turnout among these younger voters, particularly young women, who maybe would not have participated in an off-year election, who are fired up over that particular issue and are turning out. And if you live in the DC media market and you turned on Sunday Night Football, like the ads were inescapable for state legislative races. And all of these ads coming from the Democratic side focused on the issue of abortion. So I think what I'm looking for is, can we tell from turnout patterns of who turns out and where, to what extent are young voters who are disaffected with Democrats on everything else motivated by this one issue? Because that will have some implications for a year from now.
Yeah, I'm very interested in the kind of nationalization of politics and the degree to which these elections, which really are pretty local in nature, are defined by large national trends and large national issues. I mean, you look at Governor Beshear as an example. Like, you would never be able to tell that Joe Biden was president if you listened to Andy Beshear talk about anything, right? And the degree to which a lot of these Democrats, particularly in border states, and I don't mean southern border, I mean sort of border between right and left, the degree to which they have completely disassociated themselves from the party in power in Washington is quite remarkable. And so I'm interested to see if that trend holds.
And I'm with Kirsten. I'm just so uber focused on turnout. people are so dissatisfied. Does that mean they're going to vote or they're not? This Trump-Biden thing just dominates everything. How will that impact turnout today? I want to see who comes out, because you're right in that in every special election, generally Democratic turnout's been strong.
How much is the fact that people are dissatisfied a product of a media ecosystem that it has an economic incentive to inflame people? How much of it is what's actually going on in the economy, and how much of it is other things, the bowling alone?
I'm going to give you a one-word answer, and I'm turning it over to my friend. Everything. Everything. MSNBC, Fox, CNN, the media, social media, all of it. The lack of belief, faith, and trust in our institutions. Everything. What's going on in their day-to-day life, and they don't feel like government, neither side has done anything for them. It's all of it.
So there was one economic statistic that really caught my eye recently, which it came out of the jobs report from last Friday. And that is the number of Americans working multiple jobs is at a historic high. And so what some people would say, oh, that's great, right? We have a really mobile economy and people have all these, and I think, I'm not sure that most Americans want to be working multiple jobs. I think it is an expression of where we are in our economy right now, that people have to work multiple jobs to demonstrate that they can make it work, right? That they can put together what they need to do to feed their families and to afford their mortgage and to afford the eggs and gas we've talked about multiple times. And I think that there is it is tempting to say that the economic disaffection is just people being angry and not feeling good. But I think it goes deeper than that. I do think that we have an economy now that really isn't working for a lot of Americans. And the expression of dissatisfaction, notwithstanding where inflation has come and notwithstanding what the unemployment rate might be and what the Fed might do, I think for most people, what it feels like is I'm working harder and I'm getting less.
Yeah.
And why is this happening?
There's a really good principle that is not just applicable in politics policy, but just in life in general, is that happiness is reality minus expectations. And so that's not to say that voters are wrong when they're dissatisfied with things. By a lot of metrics, quality of life today is substantially higher than it was when I was born for years ago. That you now have healthcare is better. That the technology that you can buy on a paycheck is unbelievable and would have been unfathomable decades ago, right? And especially on the right, we have, for good reason, it's very optimistic. Human progress has been incredible. It's a wonderful time to be alive. There's never been a better time to be a woman. There's never been a better time to be LGBT or a person of color. I mean, this is where it's wonderful and it's all great. And yet there's a fascinating chart I saw just a couple of days ago where it said, this is kind of what economic growth has looked like, over the last century. And here's what you would have expected it to look like through the last 2 decades. And then here's kind of what happened. You hit the financial crisis, and then the line changes. And the line's still going up. We're not regressing. But if you expected that when you were 40, you'd be living a certain type of life, you may now be approaching 40 and going like, oh, I actually don't feel like I can afford to have 3 kids and a 3 or 4 bedroom house and 2 cars. I'm right now trying to figure out, can I get a couch that's not an IKEA couch? Can I keep my plants alive? So for a lot of millennials and Gen Zers, on the one hand, it's easy for older generations to say, you've got it better than any other generation. Can you believe it? You take it so for granted. And yet for many of these young people, they're like, yeah, but I kind of feel like I was sold a bill of goods. And so I think it's that gap between expectations and reality that is leading to that dissatisfaction. People felt like the American dream promised them one thing, and now they're getting another, and they are really mad about it.
And that's also true, but it's not just economic dissatisfaction.
Yes.
People are scared. People are confused. People are angry on both and all sides about what kind of country we are. I think the country's going through a debate we haven't gone through in a long, long time about what America is. And people can kind of feel this palpably.
Heather Higgins had a question, and she's always very smart about polling questions, so I know you'll have a really interesting.
So I'm interested in the plethora of issues that exist that are not necessarily the top line issues, but that might be intensely held among smaller cohorts, and the degree to which you see that playing out in actual campaigns. Do the campaigns actually use these issues? What are they, and how do you test the intensity of them to know whether or not they will in fact influence outcomes? I think it was pretty clear to some of us in 22 that abortion was likely to be a bigger issue than certainly Republicans were expecting it to be. I think Democrats completely understood how important it could be. But there were also a lot of other issues that tested well among particular demographics that you wound up not seeing being used even though they said that they cared about them a lot. So for example, the NRSC had data that over 50% of Hispanics knew personally somebody who had been canceled, and they cared a lot about cancel culture, but they never did anything with it. And I'm curious from your perspectives, how do you assess the value of these more micro issues and their efficacy and their implementation?
The way I think about issues like that is I think about, can I identify what a deal breaker issue might be? And so a great question that I would ask in a survey to try to tease that out is not necessarily, here's a list of 15 issues, tell me what your top issue is. Because when I ask that question, everybody says the economy, cost of living. I already know how that question's gonna turn out. It's useful, that has not always been the answer. The top issue was healthcare for a while. The top issue was foreign policy, national security, and terrorism during much of the 2000s. So it's not a useless question, but people saying, well, cost of living and the economy is my top issue, if they actually don't think there's a big difference between the candidates on that issue, then it can kind of wind up being a bit of a wash. So another question that I like to ask is, to what extent do you, and I'm gonna botch the wording of this, but it's something along the lines of, to what extent do you need to agree with a candidate on a particular issue in order to vote for them? And so you can say, to what extent do you need to agree with somebody on the issue of guns and the Second Amendment? And somebody can say, you must agree with me on this issue or I cannot vote for you. I'd like for you to agree with me on this issue, but even if we disagree, if we agree on enough other things, I'll still vote for you. I don't actually care if we disagree on this issue. You know, you have a scale kind of like that. And that's where you really see an issue like abortion that may only come up at 6% of people saying it's their top issue. Suddenly 40, 50 some percent of women saying, yeah, but I actually can't vote for you, even if we agree on everything else, if this isn't in alignment. And it is, while the economy is that top issue, it's some of those more sort of social and cultural issues that create those red lines that people say, I'm sorry, I just can't cross this.
We got a minute left. I want to do a lightning round question, which is, in one or two sentences, what is the thing about the public that you're most optimistic about? Whoever wants to jump in first.
I'll jump. The public's younger than me. I'm an old fart. I think I have hope because young people, even if they skew left right now, I really think are intrigued and curious and super interested in issues of freedom. And I think if we can get our act together, I think we have a great opportunity to tap into this younger voting base.
I mean, I think it's very popular now to talk about all of the challenges America has, but as I look at the rest of the world, there's a lot of screwed up stuff going on everywhere else. That's kind of the way I look at it. And America doesn't look so bad when you look around the world. So you know, we have our challenges, to be sure. But I think that some of these challenges go well beyond just what's happening in America. There are global trends that I think get expressed in even, frankly, more violent and divisive ways elsewhere as opposed to here. And I think at least here, my sense is that we still have a modicum of public trust and a belief in one another that we can arbitrate and get through some of this. Other countries I'm not so sure about. So I'm relatively more optimistic about America than other places right now.
I look at the dissatisfaction that is out there and is rampant and is intense and is broad-based as both a challenge and an opportunity, right? When people are really upset, it can lead them to excusing bad behavior on the part of their leaders, getting into sort of zero-sum mentality. Well, the other side is doing it, so I want to do it too. It can lead some bad places, but it can also lead to an environment where big, bold reform is more possible than ever. So I think about education as a great example of this. Before the pandemic, I would do surveys and I'd ask parents, how do you think K-12 schools are doing? And they'd be like, oh, schools in America are bad. But my kid's school was wonderful. And now you ask people, how do you feel about schools? And they'll say, like, my kid's school is a B-. I don't understand why we still have so many digital days. I feel like I don't understand how they're teaching math. I don't know. And suddenly, post-pandemic, there's a sense of, oh, I actually don't know that this is working. And so what that can do is open the door to the kind of big, bold reform that complacency would not have allowed previously. And so for me, while this dissatisfaction and angst that is fueling a lot of the populism and fueling in some ways a lot of the bad behavior we're seeing on the political scene, I think there's a way to channel it for good.
That's great. Well, on that note, we're going to have to close. Thank you, Kristen, Lanhee, and Joe. Let's get you back to the green room.